Hi everyone, Dr. Windsor here. Thank you for joining me for the second half of Chapter 8. In this lecture, I will cover all hazards preparation to include natural and man-made disasters, as well as personal disaster planning, local, community, and regional responses, federal emergency responses, healthcare facility responses, and immediate responses to an all hazards event. So, sounds exciting, right? Let's get started. So, just what does all hazards preparation mean? I thought you'd never ask. All hazards preparation is an all-encompassing term that refers to the many different types of emergencies. Further, emergencies are those situations that require the emergency response of outside entities, such as local, county, state, and sometimes even federal. Emergencies are also different depending on where they might occur. For example, we would plan for flooding in Arizona, but probably not blizzards or hurricanes. However, there are many similarities that exist to include response systems that are in place regarding procedures for communication and evacuation, caring for special needs patients, etc. Ultimately, the all hazards approach provides a template for generalized training and emergency preparation that can be applied in a variety of situations. So it's important that we're aware that our roles and responsibilities may expand during an emergency situation. However, they should not expand outside our scope of practice. Also, we need to have an understanding of the general principles of all hazards preparation. So, natural disasters, they are the most common type of disasters, and they can affect a very large population of people. Recently, right, in the news, we had Hurricane Ian, right, and it devastated parts of Florida. Types of natural disasters include winter storms, heat waves, earthquakes, tsunamis, tropical storms, hurricanes, floods, and tornadoes. Now, winter storms, we see things like avalanches, rock slides. There can be life-threatening cold temperatures. It can also create low visibility if there's some sort of crazy snowstorm. That could also lead to dangerous driving conditions, especially if there's like black ice or ice on the road. We could see victims that come in that have frostbite, hypothermia. Like I said, there's transportation challenges. We might have difficulty getting to the victims or getting the victims to a place where they can receive care. We might also see carbon dioxide poisoning because sometimes in these situations, individuals will leave their cars running so that they can stay warm. And if for some reason their exhaust pipe gets filled with snow, that could be pumped back into the car and they might not realize it. There was an incident in 1910 regarding the Cascade Range in Washington, and it was the worst avalanche disaster in the United States to date. There were 3 snowbound trains that were swept into a canyon, and that killed 118 people. So the flip side of that, of winter storms, is heat waves. Now, heat waves are abnormally hot weather, right? And it's worsened by humidity, because if there's high humidity, then our bodies can't function properly to cool themselves. The number one complication here we see is dehydration, but we might also see heat rash, sunburn, heat cramps, heat exhaustion, and heat stroke. So there's a table in our textbook, Table 8-1, and there's some terms there related to heat waves, so be sure to check that out. Heat waves can also increase the chance of wildfires. Then we might see victims with burns or damage to their respiratory system due to smoke inhalation. Wildfires can also destroy vegetation, and when there's no vegetation and we get heavy rains, this could also lead to landslides. In Ethiopia and the Sudan, between 1984 and 1985, there were droughts that led, because of the heat waves, led to widespread famine in Ethiopia and the Sudan. And it was estimated that 450,000 people died during that famine, which developed due to lack of water for irrigation because it was so dry and there wasn't any rain. So let's talk a little bit about earthquakes. Earthquakes happen when two portions of the Earth's crust, one above and one below, they slide by one another. This causes seismic waves, and that's what causes the shaking of the ground. And sometimes this can be very, very violent. Buildings can collapse. There can be broken gas lines and power lines, which can lead to fires. Now, earthquakes are measured with something called the Richter scale, and you can see that on table 8-2 in your textbook. And so we might see individuals with lacerations, fractures, crushing injuries. There could be burns as well, right? Next on our list of natural disasters is tsunamis. Now, earthquakes, volcanic eruptions, even meteorites and nuclear weapons testing can displace a huge amount of water, and that can trigger a tsunami. We also call that a tidal wave, and those that are at highest risk are those that live in the coastal regions. Now, in December of 2004, there was a 9.3 magnitude earthquake off the coast of Sumatra in Indonesia. And they estimate that 300,000 people were killed and 160,000 people in Indonesia were killed in Indonesia alone. And it was the deadliest tsunami and the second largest earthquake ever recorded. They said that the initial surge of water rose to a height of 108 feet in some places, including Thailand, Indonesia, Sri Lanka, and as far away as Africa and even Mexico. So let's talk a little bit about tropical storms, hurricanes, floods, and tornadoes. These are all kind of grouped together because one, is related with the other. Now, tropical storms are characterized by intense thunderstorms and really high winds. Not winds as high as hurricane winds, though. With tropical storms, we usually see winds between 39 and 73 miles per hour. Now, hurricanes can grow out of tropical storms. So tropical storms can become hurricanes. Here we see winds that are 74 miles per hour or more. And these are the larger storms that produce a lot of rain and a lot of wind. And as a result, we might see victims with fractures, lacerations, head and eye injuries, and even burns. Remember Hurricane Katrina? That was in 2005, and Katrina was the costliest and one of the deadliest hurricanes to hit the U.S. Severe destruction occurred in Mississippi and Louisiana when Katrina came to shore as a Category 3 hurricane in August of 2005, and around 80% of the city of New Orleans was flooded by the hurricane after the levee system failed, which we'll talk about again in a bit here. But in total, around 1,800 people lost their lives in Hurricane Katrina, and it caused more than $81 billion in damage. Now, flooding can also occur as a result of tropical storms or hurricanes, and we may see an increase in individuals in these situations with GI illness from drinking contaminated water that they might not know is contaminated. We might also see fractures of the head and spine, as well as eye injuries due to flying debris. Now, Hurricane Katrina, again, was the most costly disaster, and the storm surge, they say, associated with Hurricane Katrina reached around 8 meters on the Gulf Coast. So let's talk a little bit about tornadoes. Now, tornadoes are caused by the mixing of cool and warm air. And after going through this, I'm pretty sure that maybe I have a future as a meteorologist or something. But tornadoes create they are a violently rotating column of air. And in these situations, we might see victims that have multiple fractures. It could be to the head, the spine, it could be any extremity if they were picked up and thrown somewhere or a structure fell on them. We might also see eye injuries as well. And tornadoes have been observed, interestingly, on every single continent except for Antarctica. In West Bengal, in March of 1998, there was a tornado that killed 250 people and affected more than 450,000 people. All right, so we blew through, so to speak, natural disasters. I don't know why I want to keep calling them national disasters. And so now we're going to talk about man-made disasters. Man-made disasters refer to transportation accidents, acts of terrorism, or industrial incidents. And here we're going to discuss chemical and radiation release, explosions, infrastructure incidents, transportation accidents, terrorism and bioterrorism, and biological agents. So let's start with chemical and radiation release. Now, this is a life-threatening event that can cause severe damage to the environment as well as the peoples. Chemicals can cause permanent damage to the respiratory tract, eyes, and skin. And there was an industrial disaster in India, and it's considered the world's worst in history. So check out the table 8-4 for some specific chemical agents there. The one in India, I think it was some sort of gas. So radiological injuries would most likely be the result of some sort of nuclear incident. Individuals could sustain flash burns, blast injuries, ionizing radiation injuries, or permanently altered vision or blindness. They could get a severe burn of their retina from the bright flashes. And individuals can and may also develop cancer if they're exposed to radiologic substances. Fukushima nuclear disaster we had in 2011. There was also the Chernobyl disaster in 1986, and then the 3 Mile Island accident in 1979. And then lastly, there was also one called the SL1 accident, which happened in 1961. All radiologic nuclear disasters. So let's talk a little bit about explosions. Explosions typically come from bombs or other weapons of mass destruction. Could also be factory explosions or some other sort of explosions such as gas tanks, explosions inside mines. Those are all examples of ways explosions occur. And victims may present with multiple bodily injuries as well with these explosions, depending on how close they were or what the exact situation is. Now, Infrastructure incidents can include the collapse of roads or bridges or other structures like buildings and houses. These may be caused by a natural disaster, or they could be due to poor construction or poor maintenance of the infrastructure. There was a collapse of the I-35 bridge in Minnesota, and also the failure of the New Orleans levee system are a couple examples. And these incidents can cause crushing injuries and severe lacerations as well. So that brings us to transportation incidents. And a transportation incident is any accident or incident that occurs during any type of transportation. So that could include accidents occurring during road transport, rail transport, marine transport, or air transport, land, air, or sea accidents. They happen pretty infrequently, but they can result in a large scope of injuries or fatalities. Think about the Titanic, okay? Also, March 2022, China Eastern Airlines Flight 5735. There was a Boeing 737 and it crashed into the mountains. It killed 132 people, everybody that was on board. All right, so now we're going to finish up talking about man-made disasters with terrorism, bioterrorism, and biological agents. Now, the book says that terrorism is defined as the unlawful use of violence or threat of violence to instill fear and coerce governments or societies. Now, terrorists may use many different types of weapons to include chemical, biological, radiological, and nuclear. Now, terrorists are typically motivated by religious, political, or other ideological beliefs. Bioterrorism, specifically, is the use of infectious agents or germs, you might have also heard it called germ warfare, to cause illness to the peoples. So as healthcare professionals, we need to have an awareness of our facility's bioterrorism readiness plan, also called the BRP. The first sign of bioterrorism is usually when large numbers of patients are presenting with the same set of signs and symptoms. That could be an indicating factor. Biological agents, those are things, substances, germs, whatever, that can enter the body through the respiratory tract or be absorbed through mucous membranes, eyes, skin, and or open wounds. Now, those posing the highest risk, according to the CDC, there's about 6 of them, I think: anthrax, botulism, plague, smallpox, tularemia, and viral hemorrhagic fevers. They say that anthrax and smallpox are the most likely to be used as bioweapons. Now, is anybody scratching their head like me because they're concerned that the CDC has actually posted this for everyone to see? Well, typically these individuals that have been exposed to biological agents won't need surgery necessarily, but we may be called on to mobilize and care for them. So we need to know, about them and how to protect ourselves from them and how to care for patients that have been exposed to them. So let's talk a little bit about personal disaster planning, right? Because we got to think about ourselves in these situations. And if there's some sort of disaster situation, it's going to be normal for us to want to make sure our family is okay before we do anything else. We're not going to want to go into work if we don't know if our family is safe, right? So how do we take care of ourselves? What can we do? First, prior to any emergency situation. We don't want to do this in the throes of an emergency situation, but we want to gain a better understanding of local disaster management and public health agencies' recommendations as far as emergency procedures. And then we want to create a family emergency plan in the event that there is an emergency situation. We also want to gather some emergency supplies. The book calls it a go bag. So we want to have a go bag, and some things that we want to have in there are medications, emergency contact information, first aid kit, soap, toothbrush, money, toilet paper, flashlights, water, those kinds of things. Okay, there may be more things that I missed, but we want to have emergency supply go bag. We want to be sure that each family member has all of the emergency contact information tucked away somewhere where they carry it with them at all times, whether it's in a wallet or a purse or a backpack or what have you. And then go ahead and review the detailed components of creating a family emergency plan in your textbook on page 183. So now let's talk a little bit about local, community, and regional responses. So the response to a disaster situation is divided into local and federal responses. First, the local government will be burdened with the responsibility of responding first. And then over time, there's been the establishment of emergency response agencies, a standardization kind of across the board, along with the language that is used. So the development of a local emergency operation plan, which is an EOP, includes a few components, and they comprise the National Incident Management System, the Local Emergency Management Agency, and the Incident Command System. Now, the National Incident Management System, NIMS, is the national model for coordinating emergency response of governments, public health sectors, private agencies, and non-governmental organizations. So they're responsible for coordinating all the entities that are going to be responding to this emergency or disaster. Now, the Local Emergency Management Agency is called LEMA, and they're a community agency that manages and coordinates local agencies such as fire, police, and emergency medical systems in response to the emergency. And they're also going to determine and activate the Emergency Operations Center. All right. Then lastly, the Incident Command System, the ICS. Now, this is set up by LEMA, and its job is to coordinate the response to the disaster. And there's going to be one person in charge of the Incident Command System, and this person is referred to as the Incident Commander, or the IC. So there's some more details on pages 183 and 184 in your textbook. So make sure to review those because I've just kind of provided the Cliff Notes here for you. So we talked about local responses. Now let's talk a little bit about federal responses. So federal assistance is only available upon request through formal channels of the local and state governments. And once that's approved, the ICS does still retain the responsibility of coordinating the personnel, the supplies, and equipment. So how does it work? Well, typically, LEMA is going to initiate the request for federal assistance through the state government. So LEMA is going to initiate that, send that request to the governor. The governor is going to forward that request to the president that a federal disaster be declared. And this has a specific name. It's called a presidential declaration. Okay, now some agencies or entities that you need to be aware of include FEMA, the NRF, the NDMS, alphabet soup here. So let's start with FEMA. FEMA is the Federal Emergency Management Agency. It's the sister to LEMA, all right? And they're responsible for leading during a national emergency on the federal level. They're going to coordinate treatment, food, and shelter at the scene. Now, the NRF is the National Response Framework, and that is a guide for coordinating these disaster relief activities. And then lastly, the National Disaster Medical System, which is the NDMS, they're responsible for sending all of the medical equipment that is needed. They also assist with transportation needs regarding patient transportation. This also includes the following specialty teams. So there's several specialty teams under the umbrella of the National Disaster Medical System. And these are the Disaster Medical Assistant Teams, or DMATs, the Disaster Mortuary Operations Response Team, DMORT, and the National Pharmacy Response Teams, the NPRT. So make sure that you look at your textbook for additional details about those specific teams. All right, moving on to talk a little bit about the healthcare facility emergency response. Each facility should have an emergency action plan. That's an EAP, an emergency action plan. Now, the Joint Commission requires not only that facilities have them, but they practice their EAP at least twice a year and go through a simulation. Now, there are certain components that the EAP must have or address, and those include mitigation, preparedness, response, recovery, hospital incident command system, and healthcare professional responsibility. So make sure that you familiarize yourself with the details regarding these components. So the EAP must also include an outline of the facility's evacuation plan. Now, there are several things to consider in regards to the evacuation of patients from the facility. First and foremost are those logistical considerations. And these are going to include transportation and preservation of medications, blood, and blood products. Also, the availability of backup gas-powered generators to keep equipment working while you're on the move, right? Other things to consider regarding evacuation would include agreements with other facilities to take patients, right? You have to have a safe place to move your patients. So along with that, it's a good idea to have a list of safe locations where patients can be moved in the event that an evacuation does need to occur. Some other things we need to think about are forms for tracking the location of the patients and their health status. And we also need to have a plan in place for the transportation of medical records. That is very important. And as surgical technologists, we're very valuable during this time. I mean, we're always valuable, come on. But in this situation, we have extensive knowledge regarding patient transport and positioning, so we can really help out a lot in this, in the event that there is an evacuation. All right, so we're going to finish up our discussion on all hazards preparation by discussing important considerations regarding immediate response to an all hazards event. So first, we need to ensure that the scene is safe prior to entering the scene in a disaster, all right? If the building is teetering on one little stick, you don't want to go running in there, right? So we want to make sure that we can make the scene as safe as possible before we enter it, All right. The healthcare professional will also need to set up a safe zone as soon as possible before we start bringing patients in to triage and treat them, right? We want to make sure if it's a place where we're setting up shop, that it's actually safe for us and the patients to set up shop there. So we want to make sure that we are wearing our PPE and that we're wearing it correctly. Also, remember standard and universal precautions. We talked about those before. We want to make sure that we are following those at all times, right? We need to also consider the possible need for a separate patient decontamination area if the patient has been exposed to toxic chemicals or radiation or something of the sort. And then we need to follow protocols in regard to that specific exposure, right? So it's going to vary depending on the type of disaster. Next, we need to triage the patients, right? And if at all possible, there needs to be some sort of process or tagging system to indicate triage category. This could be using red, yellow, green tags. Other popular systems for triaging include START and DIME. So START is simple triage and rapid treatment, and DIME is delayed, immediate, minimal, expectant. So whatever the system is, we just need to have one, okay? And then a separate area should be designated as a point of distribution site. And this might sound familiar because of what we just went through with COVID, but a site for providing vaccines and medications to a large population. I don't know about you guys, but I went to the Cardinal Stadium to get vaccinated, and the very first time that I went, was waiting in my car through some crazy Disneyland-esque line for about 4 hours. When I went to get my second immunization, it was only about 2 hours. So I guess they improved their process a little bit, but I think the second time I went at like 5:30 in the morning. So nobody wants to go get a shot at 5:30 in the morning. So there wasn't as many people as at like 4 o'clock in the afternoon. So you may see something like that when there's some sort of disaster or emergency situation like we did during COVID. That's pretty fresh in our minds. And it's also important that information is disseminated or distributed to the public in a timely manner, and that it is as accurate as possible so they get the right information that they need so that they can act accordingly. They may choose not to do it, but we need to get the information out there. So let's wrap up our discussion with a few more considerations regarding immediate response to an all hazards event. Couple more things. It's important to mention that these situations are going to require us to make difficult decisions about victims' care. So that's where moral, ethical, and legal issues associated with providing care during a disaster comes into play. And additionally, there's still going to be that normal day in and day out care, right, that patients need. They may not have been impacted by the disaster or the emergency, but they have a ruptured appendix, or they have a perforated bowel, or they fell off the roof and broke their leg. So there's still going to be that ongoing treatment of those that are not impacted by the disaster. And then the last thought that I'll leave you with is that there are systems in place for health professional volunteers who want to and who can respond to an emergency situation in their state. One is the emergency system for the Advanced Registration of Volunteer Health Professionals, ESAR VHP. And then there's also the Community Emergency Response Team, CERT. So ESAR, each state has an ESAR, and that is in place to help individuals pre-register if they can and are willing to respond to emergencies within their state, and also outside of their state, actually. And then those volunteers are deployed through something called the Emergency Management Assistant Compact, EMAC. And then lastly, CERT. CERT is the Community Emergency Response Team, and these are individuals, individuals who wish to become a member of the Community Emergency Response Team have to complete specific training through the agency, such as the fire department or the police department, and then they are specially trained in all hazards preparation and basic response, and then they gain a certification. All right, so those are them. Don't know what else to say. Okay, so that's it. That's the end of chapter 8. We learned a lot about emergency situations and all hazards preparations. Great job, guys. Thanks for sticking in there with me. I appreciate you. So that brings us to the end of our discussion on chapter 8. And I know it's not the most exciting topic, but it is important that we have an understanding of the procedures that involve preparing for various disasters, as well as how we'll need to respond in emergency situations and how surge techs can and will be used during those situations. So I hope this was helpful for you. I hope it facilitated your learning. I don't know, there probably weren't too many giggles, but hopefully it was helpful and it wasn't too painful. Okay, thanks for listening. Take care.